Last time we spoke about the rise of the spirit soldier movement. As a result of the hardship brought upon the common people of China during China's warlord era, a new group known as the spirit soldiers rose up. Motivated by grievances against warlord abuses and foreign influences, the spirit soldiers emerged as a grassroots movement seeking to overthrow the oppressive regime. They believed in summoning divine beings or becoming possessed by them to aid their cause, reminiscent of the Yihu Tuan. Despite lacking centralized organization and firearms, they managed to seize control of several counties in the regions of Hubei and Sichuan. However, they simply were no match for warlord armies, who were better trained, better organized, and certainly better armed. While in small groups, the spirit armies managed just fine, but when they assembled 100,000 strong, they were ultimately crushed. Despite this, the last spirit rebellion would occur in 1959. This episode is the Mongolian Revolution of 1921. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Do you maybe want to hear more so about the Empire of Japan? I've just released a documentary talking about the opening of Tokugawa Japan and the Meiji Restoration. Also, please check out my booming Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the Patreon exclusive podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. Please check it out. Oh yes, we are not done with Mongolia just yet. As a quick refresher, a few episodes back we talked about what was known as the occupation of Mongolia. Quite a few things were going on all at once in the 1910s. The Russian Empire collapsed, and now it was stuck in a civil war with the Reds versus the Whites. The Republic of China likewise collapsed into the warlord era. Mongolia was stuck between these two former empires, attempting to gain independence herself, but swiftly fell into conflict with radicals from both. As a result of the Russian white general Grigory Semyonov trying to force a new pan-Mongolian state, Duanshire exploited the situation to forcibly invade Mongolia. Duanshire had been taking a lot of heat for pushing China to declare war on Germany, and getting caught taking some secret loans from the Empire of Japan. Everyone in China was calling Duanshire to reduce or eliminate the Anhui army, but the situation in Mongolia gave him the perfect excuse to use it, thus in his mind legitimizing its existence. Duanshire dispatched General Shushu Jang with the Northwest Frontier Army to protect Mongolia from the supposed Red Army invasion. In the face of overwhelming military forces, the Mongolians submitted to Shushu Jang, and they were absolutely humiliated and subjugated, and thus Mongolia lived happily ever after. But no, not at all. Between 1919 and 1920, a few Mongolian nobles came together to form two groups. The first was called the Consular, the Consular Hill. The second, Zun Kuri, the East Urga group. The first group was the brainchild of Doksun Budu, a prominent Mongolian politician. Budu had worked as a Mongolian language teacher at the Russian-Mongolian School for translators. He spoke Mongolian, Tibetan, Mandarin, and Manchu. Because of his work, he came into contact with Bolshevism through Russian acquaintances. After the occupation of Mongolia by Duanshire's forces, he formed the secret Consular Hill group as a means of resistance. Dubu's Consular Hill soon saw Korlugin Choibalsan join. Choibalsan also worked at the Russian-Mongolian Translator School, and he shared a yurt with Dubu. Dubu was a mentor to Choibalsan, who worked primarily as a Russian interpreter at the Russian consulate. Because of the nature of his work, Choibalsan spent a lot of time with the Soviets. Not to give too much away, but later on Choibalsan would become known as the, quote, Stalin of Mongolia. And that certainly says a lot about his character, I guess. A Russian Mongolian printing officer, typesetter named Mikhail Kudashenko, a Bolshevik in Urga, visited Dubu and Choibalsan, talking to them about things related to Mongolian independence and actively resisting the Chinese. The East Urga group was founded by Sulin Danzan, an official of the Ministry of Finance, and Dansranbalgin Doksam, an official in the Ministry of the Army. Danzan had once been a horse thief, but managed to climb the ladder towards being a customs officer for the Ministry of Finance. Doksam had worked as a scribe for a district in a provincial assembly before taking a job with the Ministry of Finance and then the Army later on. Another founding member was Damdin Sukbatar, who grew up around Russians and spoke Russian. He joined the New Mongolia Army in 1911 after the independence movement, and he rose through the ranks, seeing deployment on Mongolia's eastern border. After his death, he would be referred to as the, quote, Lenin of Mongolia. The beginning of the East Urga group saw radicals within the lower house of the Mongolian parliament, such as Danzan and Doksam, meet secretly trying to figure out a way to get rid of Shushu Jang and the Chinese dominance over their nation. The groups formed a plot to seize the Mongolian army's arsenal and to assassinate Shushu Jang, but the arsenal was too well guarded, and Shushu Jang departed the region before they could pull it off. Within Urga, there were many Russian refugees, both red and white alike. They established a municipal Duma, and some of the Bolshevik-minded ones learned of the secret Consular Hill and East Urga groups. In March of 1920, the Duma was sending one of their members, Sorokovikov, to Irkutsk, but before he did so, they thought it would be a good idea for him to learn about these secret groups and what they were up to. Sorokovikov met with the representatives of both groups before traveling to Irkutsk. When he returned to Urga in June of that year, he met with the representatives again, with promises the USSR would provide any assistance needed to the Mongolian workers. He then extended them invitations to send their groups of representatives to Russia to discuss the matters further. Now, as you can imagine, both these groups were pretty excited by this. Until this point, the two groups did not brush shoulders much. They were in fact very different from another. The Consular Hill group were progressive socialists, while the East Urga group were more nationalistic. While they seemed to be at odds with each other, the Soviet invitation had brought them together, and in doing so they decided to merge on June the 25th to form the Mongolian People's Party. It was then agreed Danzan and Choibalsan would act as the delegates that would go to Russia. Both men arrived to Verkhnudinsk, the new capital of the pro-Soviet Far Eastern Republic. They met with Boris Shemetsky, the acting head of the government. Shemetsky kind of gave them the cold shoulder, as they hounded his government for military assistance to fight off the Chinese. Shemetsky advised them they should go back home and get members of their party over in Urga to send a coded message with a stamped seal of the Bogd Khan to formally request such a thing. They did just that, and now 5 delegates returned to Verkhnudinsk with it. But Shemetsky told them he had no real authority to make such a decision, and that they needed to go to Irkutsk. So yeah, it was one of those cases where a guy you thought was the head honcho was really not. The Mongolian delegates then went to Irkutsk in August, where they met with the head of what would soon become the Far Eastern Secretariat of the Communist International, aka the Comintern. They explained that they required military assistance, soon handing over a list of requests. They wanted military instructors, over 10,000 rifles, some artillery pieces, machine guns, and of course, a ton of funding so they could recruit soldiers. The head told them to draft a letter, and this time to make sure the name of the party was included in it, not in the name of the Bogd Khan. They were also to list their objectives and requests. Now, as funny as this all sounds, not to dox myself, but when I got my first big boy job, we'll call it, I had to learn how to write formal letters to the government for funding requests, partnership things, etc. And I can feel for these guys in that sense. They all seemed to have little experience in such matters, and yes, some officials were clearly just messing with them, sending them left, right, and center. But some guys were trying to show them how to work in the existing process. Sorry, that was just a random rant on my part. Once they were finished the new letter, they were told it might be considered by the Siberian Revolutionary Committee in Omsk. The buck just kept passing on. At this point, the Mongolians divided themselves into 3 groups. Delegates Danzan, Losel, and Dendev went to Omsk to deliver the new letter. Bodu and Doksam went to Urga to grow the party and begin recruiting an army. and Sukbatar and Chobalsan went to Irkutsk to serve as liaisons there. Before they all departed, they drafted a new revolutionary message. It dictated the Mongolian nobility would soon be divested of their hereditary powers. The new system of government would be democratic, with a limited monarch run by the Bogd Khan. Several more meetings with the Soviets at Omsk occurred only for the Mongolians to be sold yet again that they had to go somewhere else. This time it was to Moscow. Stanzan led a team of delegates to go to Moscow in September. For over a month they discussed matters, but something huge was cooking up in the meantime. Here comes a man named Roman von Unan Sternberg. He was born in Graz, Austria, in January of 1886 to a noble family descending from present-day Estonia. Unan Sternberg's first language was German, but he also spoke English, French, Russian, and Estonian. Within his family tree, he had Hungarian roots, and he would claim to be a descendant of Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Why is it all of these great men figures always have to come up with some story that I descended from X? Regardless, he moved to Reval, the capital of Estonia, and it said as a child he was a ferocious bully and quite a little psychopath who would torture animals. Apparently, at the age of 12, he strangled his cousin's owl. And, sorry for my language, that's fucked up. Now, Unan Sternberg was very proud of his supposed aristocratic background, though whether any of it was real, who knows. He wrote extensively things like, "For centuries, my family never took orders from the working classes, and it was outrageous that dirty workers who've never had any servants of their own, but still think they can command. They should have absolutely no say in the ruling of the vast Russian Empire." He was proud of his Germanic origin, but also identified with the Russian Empire and with Genghis Khan. So yeah, he was kind of all over the place from where he was taking this supposed ancestry from. When asked about his family's military history in the Russian Empire, he would proudly boast, 72 family members were killed in the wartime. He believed many of the fallen monarchies of Europe could be restored with the help of the cavalry people of the steppe, such as the Mongols. Unan Sternberg, of course, was attracted to military service, and during the Russo-Japanese War, he joined the fighting. It's unsure whether he made it to Manchuria to see the actual fighting, but he was awarded a Russo-Japanese War Medal in 1913. During the First Russian Revolution of 1905, Estonian peasants ravaged the countryside, trying to murder any nobles they could get their hands on. Unan Sternberg recalled, "The peasants that worked on my family's land were rough, untutored, wild, and constantly angry, hating everybody and everything without understanding why." After the failed revolution, he continued his military career and he picked up an interest in Buddhism. Later in life, while in Mongolia, he would become a Buddhist, but never really relinquished his Lutheran faith. While in Mongolia, Unan Sternberg became obsessed with the idea that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. Because, of course, he is. Seriously, I'm just going to say, I'm getting extreme Alexander the Great vibes from this guy. When he graduated from a military academy, he demanded a station amongst the Cossacks in Asia. He was appointed an officer in eastern Siberia, where he served under the 1st Argunsky, and later the 1st Argunsky Cossack regiments. From there he fell in love with the lifestyle of the nomadic Mongolian people. He was a hell of a drunk, and he loved to get drunk and pick fights. There were theories he had been hit so many times in the head during these fights that it's believed he probably received some brain damage, and he went insane as a result. In 1913, he asked to be transferred to the reserves because he wanted time and space to achieve a new goal of his. He sought to assist the Mongols in their struggle for independence from China. Russian officials heard rumors that he sought to do this, and they actively thwarted him as best as they could. He went to the town of Kopt in western Mongolia, where he served as an unofficial officer in the Cossack Guard detachment of the Russian consulate. When World War I broke out, Unan Sternberg joined the 34th Regiment of the Cossack troops stationed in the Galicia frontier. He would take part in the first Russian offensive against Prussia, and he earned a reputation as an extremely brave but also a very reckless and mentally unstable officer. Men who came to know him said he looked happiest atop a horse leading a charge. showing no signs of fear, with a wicked smile on his face. He received multiple citations, such as the St. George of the 4th grade, St. Vladimir of the 4th grade, St. Anna of the 3rd and 4th grades, and St. Stanislas of the 3rd grade. These decorations, however, were offset by the amount of disciplinary actions issued against him, and he would eventually be discharged from one of his commands for attacking another officer in a drunken brawl. He was sent to prison and court-martialed. After he got out of prison in January of 1917, he was transferred over to the Caucasian theater to fight the Ottomans. Then the Russian Revolution began, ending the Russian Empire and, of course, ending the Romanov monarchy. It was quite a bitter blow to the monarchist Unun Sternberg. While still in the Caucasus, Unun Sternberg ran into a Cossack captain, an old friend we met a few podcasts ago, Captain Grigory Semyonov. Working with Semyonov, the two organized a volunteer Assyrian Christian unit in modern-day Iran. The Assyrian genocide had led to thousands of Assyrians fleeing over to the Russians. Semyonov and Unun Sternberg's Assyrian force was able to win some small victories over Turkish forces. But in the grand scheme of the theater, it did not amount to too much. The experience of forging such a group, however, led them to think about doing the same thing with Buryat troops in Siberia. At the outbreak of the Russian Civil War, Semyonov and Unun Sternberg declared themselves Romanov loyalists, joining the White Movement. They both vowed to defeat the Red Army, and late into 1917, they, as part of a combined group of 5 Cossacks, managed to disarm 1,500 Russian soldiers at the Far Eastern Railway Station in China near the Russian border. They took up a position there, preparing for a military expedition into the Transbaikal region, recruiting men into a special Manchurian regiment. The White Army managed to defeat the Red Army along the Far Eastern Railway territory. Semyonov eventually appointed Unun Sternberg to be the commander of a force at Darya, a railway station, and at a strategic point southeast of Lake Baikal. Despite being part of the White Movement, Semyonov and Unun Sternberg were quite rebellious. Semyonov, for example, refused to recognize the authority of Admiral Alexander Kolchak, the prominent leader in Siberia of the White Movement. Semyonov fancied acting on his own, and he received support from the Japanese. Unun Sternberg, a subordinate to Semyonov, also acted independently. Unun Sternberg also had his own reasons not to comply fully with Kolchak. Kolchak had promised after a White victory he would reconvene a constitutional assembly, disband the Bolsheviks completely, and then decide the future for Russia, that being if they would readopt the monarchy or choose a different path. Unun Sternberg believed God had chosen Russia to be run by a monarchy, and its restoration came first. Yes, Unun Sternberg was probably the most pro-monarchy guy I have ever written about. I mean, he would make Churchill blush. Unun Sternberg performed successful military campaigns in Darya and Khaylar, earning the rank of Major General, prompting Semyonov to entrust him with forming his own military unit to fight the communists. Both men gradually recruited Buryats and Mongols for the task, but they also were growing wary of another. Unun Sternberg was unhappy with Semyonov, who he deemed to be too corrupt. He also took issue with the man's love interest in a Jewish cabaret singer. He was, after all, a unbelievably rampant anti-Semite. Unun Sternberg founded the volunteer-based Asiatic Cavalry Division in Darya, alongside a fortress. It is said at his fortress he would torture his red enemies, and it was full of their bones. As we mentioned in a previous episode, the Anhui clique dispatched General Shushu Jang to occupy Outer Mongolia. However, after the First Anhui-Juli War, the Anhui clique was severely reduced, and General Shushu Jang's forces in Mongolia were as well. This effectively left the Mongolian protectorate without their protectors. Chaos reigned as Chahar Mongols from Inner Mongolia began to fight with Khalkaz Mongols from Outer Mongolia. Seeing the disunity, Unun Sternberg saw a grand opportunity, and he made plans to take control over Mongolia. He began networking, and he married the Manchurian princess Ji at Harbin. Princess Ji was a relative of General Jiang Kuwu, the commander of Chinese troops in the western part of the Chinese Manchurian Railway territory, as well as the governor of Khaylar. He also tried to arrange a meeting between Semyonov and Zhang Zolin. Eventually, Kolchak's White Army was defeated by the Red Army, and subsequently, the Japanese pulled their expeditionary forces out of the Transbaikal region. This put Semyonov in a very bad situation, as he was unable to cope with the full brunt of the impending Red forces. Thus he planned to pull back into Manchuria. Unun Sternberg had a different idea, however. He took his Asiatic cavalry division, roughly 1,500 men at the time, consisting mostly of Russians, but there were Cossacks, Buryats, Chinese, and a few Japanese, with a few machine guns and 4 artillery pieces. He broke his ties to Semyonov and he took his division into Outer Mongolia in October of 1920. They gradually advanced to Urga, where they ran into Chinese occupying forces. Unun Sternberg attempted to negotiate with the Chinese, demanding they disarm, but they rejected his terms. In late October and early November, Unun Sternberg's forces assaulted Urga, suffering 2 disastrous defeats. After this, they assailed the Setsen Khan Amag, a district north of the Kurlan River, ruled by Prince Setsen Khan. During this time in Mongolia, Unun Sternberg befriended some Mongol forces seeking independence from the Chinese occupation, the most influential leader amongst them being the Bogd Khan. The Bogd Khan secretly made a pact with Unun Sternberg, seeking his aid to expel the Chinese from Mongolia. Unun Sternberg went to work reorganizing his army. Apparently he had taken a liking to a lieutenant, and he gave the man full command over the medical division. During a withdrawal, the lieutenant raped multiple nurses in the medical division, many of whom were married to other officers. He also ordered settlements they ran by to be looted, and he ordered all the wounded to be poisoned because he thought that they were a nuisance. Unun Sternberg had the man flogged and he burned him at the stake. So yeah. During the Chinese occupation of Outer Mongolia, they had initiated strict regulations over Buddhist services and imprisoned anyone whom they considered sought independence, including Russians. While Unun Sternberg had 1,500 well-trained troops, the Chinese had roughly 7,000 still in Outer Mongolia. The Chinese enjoyed an advantage in more men, more machine guns, more artillery, and they had already fortified Urga. On February 2nd, Unun Sternberg assaulted the front line of Urga again. His forces were led by Captain Ryzikin, who managed to capture a front-line fortification near the small and big Madachan villages due southeast of Urga. Unun Sternberg's forces also managed to rescue the Bogd Khan, who was under house arrest, transporting him over to the Manjushri monastery. Unun Sternberg then took a page out of Genghis Khan's notebook, ordering his troops to light a large number of campfires in the hills surrounding Urga, trying to scare the Chinese into thinking they were more numerous. On February the 4th, they attacked the Chinese barracks east of Urga, capturing them. Unun Sternberg then divided his force into 2, with the first attacking the Chinese trade settlement at Maimaicheng, and the second the Consular settlement. Unun Sternberg's men used explosives and improvised battering rams to blow up the gates at Maimaicheng. Upon storming the settlement, the battle turned into a melee of sabers, seeing both sides hack each other in a great slaughter. Unun Sternberg's men took Maimaicheng, and soon they joined up with the other force to attack the Consular settlement. The Chinese launched a counterattack, forcing Unun Sternberg's men northeast somewhat, but then he counterattacked, sending them right back to Urga. By the night of the 4th, Urga would fall to the invaders. The Chinese civilian and military officials simply fled for their lives in 11 cars, abandoning the soldiers. The Chinese troops followed suit, thereafter heading north, massacring all Mongolian civilians they came across, heading over the Russian border. The Red Russians residing in Urga fled alongside them. The Chinese had apparently suffered 1,500 casualties, while Unun Sternberg recorded only 60 casualties for his force. Unun Sternberg's troops were welcomed with open arms as liberators. The populace of Urga hated their tyrannical Chinese overlords, and they believed the Russians were their salvation. Then the Russians began plundering the Chinese-run stores and hunted down all the Russian Jews still in the city. Unun Sternberg personally ordered the execution of all Jews in the city unless they had a special note handed out to them by him sparing their lives. It is estimated roughly 50 Jews were killed by Unun Sternberg's men in Mongolia. Urga's Jewish community was completely annihilated. After a few days, Unun Sternberg then set up a quasi-secret police force led by Colonel Leonid Subalov, who hunted Red Russians. Meanwhile, Unun Sternberg's army seized the Chinese fortified base at Joy, due south of Urga. During the attack, the Russians numbered 900, the Chinese garrison roughly 1,500. After taking the fort, the Russians returned to Urga as Unun Sternberg dispatched expeditionary groups to find Chinese strength. They came across an abandoned Chinese fort at Zamud, taking it without resistance. Most of the Chinese troops left Mongolia and they withdrew north to Kyakta, where they were trying to find a way to get around Urga to escape back to China. Unun Sternberg and his men assumed that they were trying to reorganize to recapture Urga, so he dispatched forces to assail them. Chinese forces were advancing through the area of Tal Ulan Kad Hill when Unun Sternberg initiated a battle. The battle saw nearly 1,000 Chinese, 100 Mongols, and various amounts of Russians, Buryats, and others killed. The Chinese forces completely routed during the battle, fleeing south until they got over the Chinese border. After this action, the Chinese effectively had departed Outer Mongolia. On February the 22nd of 1921, Unun Sternberg, Mongolian princes and lamas held a ceremony to restore the Bogd Khan to the throne. To reward their savior, the Bogd Khan granted Unun Sternberg a high title, that of Dakhan Gosho Chinwang, in the degree of Khan. Once Semyonov heard of what Unun Sternberg had achieved, he likewise promoted him to lieutenant general. On that same day, Mongolia proclaimed itself independent as a monarchy under the Bogd Khan, now the 8th Bogd Gigin, Jepsundamba, Kotoktu. According to the eyewitness account of the Polish explorer Kamil Giedzicki, a Polish writer, Ferdynand Antoni Ossendonski, Unun Sternberg went to work ordering Urga's streets thoroughly cleaned, promoted religious tolerance, and I would imagine he excluded Jews and attempted some economic reforms. The writer Ossendonski had previously served in Kolchak's government, but after its fall, he sought refuge in Mongolia. He became friends with Unun Sternberg, probably looking for a good story. I mean, this absolute maniac does make for a good story. Hell, I am covering him after all. Ossendonski would write pieces of his experience in Mongolia in his book titled Beasts, Men, and Gods. There was also a soldier within Unun Sternberg's army named Dmitry Alyoshin, who wrote a novel as well as his experience titled Asian Odyssey. Here is a short passage about his description of Unun Sternberg and his closest followers' beliefs at the time. The whole world is rotten. Greed, hatred, and cruelty are the saddle. We intend to organize a new empire, a new civilization. It will be called the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire, carved out of Mongolia, Manchuria, and eastern Siberia. Communication has already been established for that purpose with the Jiangzolin, the warlord of Manchuria, and with the Hutukta, the living Buddha of Mongolia. Here in these historic plains, we will organize an army as powerful as that of Genghis Khan. Then we will move, as that great man did, and smash the whole of Europe. The world must die, so that a new and better world may come forth, reincarnated on a higher plane. Now, within that passage, there was mention of the Hutukta. He was the dominant Buddha of Mongolia at the time. Hutukta did not share Unun Sternberg's dream of restoring monarchies all across the world, and he understood the man's army could not hope to defend them from Soviet or Chinese invaders. In April of 1921, Hutukta wrote to Beijing asking if the Chinese government was interested in resuming their protectorateship. In the meantime, Unun Sternberg began looking for funding. He approached several Chinese warlords, such as Jiang Zolin, but all rejected him. And of course, he continued his tyrannical treatment, never against Mongolians though, but against specifically Russians within Mongolia. It's estimated his secret police force killed 846 people, with roughly 120 being in Urga. Unun Sternberg's men were not at all happy about the brutality he inflicted upon their fellow Russians. Yet, Unun Sternberg's days of psychopathic fun were soon coming to an end. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Over there I'm releasing a series of very long documentaries. This month I'm releasing one on the opening of Japan and the Meiji Restoration. Yet the film I am using for these documentaries is 3 years old when I couldn't even pronounce Meiji. So it might be worth your time to see how stupid I was back then, although I still am stupid today. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. The last poll has finished, and it seems the next episode for the exclusive podcast will be about the A6M Zero Fighter and the F4F Wildcat, so please go check it out. Poor Mongolia was stuck between two crumbling empires, who both became engulfed in violent civil wars. The spillover from their wars saw Mongolia become a protectorate to the Chinese, nearly a satellite communist state to the USSR, and now she was independent, but really at the mercy of the White Army of Unun Sternberg. The psychopath was having a field day, but it was all about to come to an end.